My name is Harriet Tubman, and I was born in the Chesapeake Bay, which is very near what you know as Washington, D.C. And when I was born into what they called a slave quarter, which is where slaves lived, and we lived in little shacks. Our shack was about the size of 10 by 12 feet. And we would sleep there on a pile of straw, a lot like a pile of puppies, because we didn't have beds. Most of you probably sleep in beds. Well, I didn't have a bed to sleep in. We would sleep there. We would have quilts to put over us to keep us warm at night, quilts that our ma had made and that the other women had made. And sometimes men helped make quilts too. But when I was a little girl, about 8 years old, I went to the neighbors. I was loaned to them, and I was working for a woman named Miss Susan. And Miss Susan had a beautiful house. She had beautiful furniture, but she never let me sit in it because I was a black slave girl. So I was to take care of the baby, and I would rock the baby, and whenever the baby made any noise, you know what would happen? I would get beaten. So I did my best to keep that baby as quiet as possible. And at nighttime, they would sleep and I would sit next to the bed on the floor because I couldn't sit in the furniture, and I would rock the baby, and the moment the baby would wake up, I would hush the baby. And I would rock the baby and make sure the baby made no noise. And really, what happened was God used that, because later, when I was in the Underground Railroad, I could sleep and hear everything. So although it was awful, it turned out to be something that was very helpful, a skill for me later. One time, Miss Susan said, she said, Minty, my basket name was Minty. And until you got older, you didn't get your real name. And so they said, Minty, would you go set the table? So I was setting the table for Miss Susan, and I saw a lump of sugar. Well, we never had sugar. We got sugar at Christmas, and we got sugar on our birthdays, and that was about it. So I took the piece of sugar and just plopped it in my mouth. Well, Miss Susan saw me, and she said, Minty, you go out and you get a switch and you wait for me to get out there. She was always beating me. So I went out, and rather than getting a switch, you know what I did? I took off running down the road. I ran as fast as I could. I ran 5 miles. I went 5 miles till I got to a farmhouse. And I ran up into the barn, and I went up into the hayloft, and I just hid up there, and my heart was pounding because I thought if she finds me, she's going to beat me, or she's going to take me back to my owner, and he'll beat me. So I stood there, and then I sat down, and then I lay down, and I just fell asleep. I woke up several hours later, and I was hungry because I'd run 5 miles. Well, I went down in the barn, and there were some pigs, and the pigs were eating pig slop, which doesn't sound very appetizing, but I was hungry. And really, it wasn't that much different than what I usually ate, table scraps. So I was eating the slop of the pigs, and I said to God, God, should I just stay here and hide out in the barn? Someday they're going to find me. And if they find me, they're going to beat me or send me down south in the chain gang. What should I do, God? And so I decided after praying to God that I would go back to Miss Susan. And I did. I walked back, and she, sure enough, beat me. And then she took me back to my family. Well, my family, welcome. These are my friends. And I'm telling this story about when I was a little girl. And when I went back to, from Miss Susan's house, what they did was, my pa said, you come work with me, Minty. So I went across the road to the Stewarts. This was another plantation, and I would chop wood. How many of you ever chopped wood? Is it pretty hard work?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, I could chop about as much wood as 2 cords a day. Do you know how many 2 cords a day is? That's 4 foot by 4 foot by 8 foot. A square times 2. I could chop that. Most men can chop 1 cord of wood a day. I could chop 2 cords. Now you can see I wasn't very tall. I was 5 foot. But I was strong. And my pa, when we were over there across the road and there were no white folks around, we would talk about the railroad. But we never talked I mean the Underground Railroad. We could be beaten, we could be killed, because they didn't want to know about the railroad. So my Pa and I would talk about it all day long, and I would say, well, Pa, where does it go? Well, it goes north. Well, where? Well, Philadelphia was the place where you knew you were free, and so it went to Philadelphia, and then it would go to New York, and then it eventually went to Canada. Well, how do you get on it? Well, you just get up in the middle of the night and you start running. But how do you know which way is north? He says, well, you look up at the sky. You look up at the sky and you look for the Big Dipper. And at the Big Dipper, you look for the North Star and you just head that way. I said, well, Pa, what if it's not stars? The stars are not. What do you do? He says, well, then you go over to a tree. Come here, Minty. I went to the tree, I felt the tree, and she said, on the north side of the tree is the moss. So you'd feel for the moss, and you'd head that way. Huh. He also taught me how to walk like a deer, how to walk and make no noise at all. Try it tonight at home. See, ask your mom or your dad if you can walk and make no noise at all. Because I needed to have that skill on the railroad. Well, one day we went to this thing called the corn shucking contest. It was during harvest time, about October, and different plantations were coming together. And we liked this because we got to see our family, because they would sell us away from each other. And so we were coming together and we got to see our family, our relatives, our aunts, our uncles, our mas, our pas, and we would shuck corn. That means you take the husks off the corn and we would put it on this scale. And one of the masters was weighing it, and he put on this side, he put a big pile of corn, and on this side, he was putting weight. Well, I was standing next to this man, a young slave man who was tall and strong, and I don't know, he just looked smart. And I thought, he's the kind of person that would run on the railroad. So I stood next to him, and I just said to him, railroad? And he looked at me and said, shh, hush. So I thought maybe if I stood next to him, I would learn something about the railroad. Well, when the master was putting on the weights, all of a sudden, sure enough, that man I was standing next to took off running, because this was a great opportunity. There was no one else around, and everyone was laughing and smiling and having a great old time, and no one was watching for someone running away. So he took off running, and the master took one of those 2-pound weights, and he threw it at the man as hard as he could. And he didn't hit the man, but you know who he hit? He hit me right here in my forehead. I was 12 years old, and I went down on the ground, and it was such a force it could have killed me, actually. And I just lay there in a pool of blood. And my mom came over, and she picked me up, she took me back to our shack. She laid me on the bed, and she just started praying. I lay on that bed for 6 weeks. I never once got up. And I prayed when I would wake up, and then I would just, the pain was so bad, and they had no medicine like they have today. I had no medicine. And I would just pass out from the pain, and then I would wake up at night, and there were always a crowd of the elders around me, and they were praying. And they were saying, save Minty, God, save her, because I know you've got something, if she lives, you got something special for her to do with her life. So for those 6 weeks, I thought, maybe I'm supposed to do something special with my life. Well, as you can see, I did not die. And I got up out of that bed, and I went back to work with my pa. And once I got out of that bed, they called me Harriet, because Harriet was a name of honor. And they said, God's going to do something with your life, child, so you just wait and see. Now, what's important about this is, when you tell people they're going to do something great, like your teacher, Mr. Wilkins, when he tells you you're going to be great, you're going to do something great. Because if someone believes in you, that's all you need. So, I was over there working. And when I was working one day, I came across someone that I thought was pretty interesting. His name was John Tubman. And he was handsome. And I fell in love with him. I was about 20 years old. Well, when you're a slave woman and you fall in love, you know what you do? You make a quilt. Now, I told you I could chop wood. I was very strong. I could work as much as 10 men in the day. In fact, one time my master had some friends over and they were having drinks and talking, and they said, come down and see Harriet. She's the hardest worker we have. And they hooked me up to a barge, and I pulled this huge barge full of stones, and they clapped and they hollered, and I thought, boy, they think I'm great. And then I thought, they're looking at me like I'm a donkey, and I didn't like that at all. Because they just like me because I'm strong and I do more work for them. Well, at home I would come home and I said to Ma, I think I'm going to marry John Tubman. And she said, well, Harriet, then you've got to get to work on your quilt. I do, Ma? And she said, yes, you do. We didn't have orange plastic chairs, but I used to sit down by the fire at night. I'd come home and I was just plumb tuckered out. And I would sit down by the fire and I would have what dinner we would have. And then Ma would say, get out your quilt, Harriet. Yes, Ma. And I would get my quilt out, and I would make stitches. She would say, let me see them, Harriet. They're too big. Make them smaller. And I would stitch, and I would stitch, and I would stitch. I would much rather chop wood than I would quilt in this quilt. But after 3 years, I finished it. 3 years, working every night. It takes a quilt a long time to make a quilt. So, came time for our wedding, and on our wedding day, I wrapped this up in some brown paper, and I gave my husband, John Tubman, this quilt. Now, John Tubman was a freed man. He wasn't a slave. He lived across the road in his own house, and he was paid a little money. Slaves were never paid anything, but he was paid money. And the first night of our wedding, we went to bed and we put this quilt up, and I thought I was the luckiest woman in the world because I was in love. A couple of months later, I said to him, John Tubman, someday I'm going to be free like you because I'm going to go on the railroad. And he said the strangest thing to me. He said, Harriet Tubman, if you run away to your freedom, I'm going to go and tell your master, and he's going to bring you back and beat you. You know, I have been beaten in my life many times, but nothing hurt as much as having my husband, John Tubman, say that to me. That betrayed my heart. So I decided from that moment on I was not going to tell him about anything. I was just going to go on the railroad by myself. So I told my brothers, I had 3 brothers, I told my brothers that I needed their help, and they said, Harriet Tubman, we'll go with you. We're men. We'll keep you safe.